The cowboy, dressed in weathered leather boots, faded denim jeans, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen countless sunrises and sunsets, had long become a figure synonymous with the rugged beauty of the West. His horse, a sturdy and muscular stallion, named Thunder, moved with a purposeful grace, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they traversed the vast, untamed plains. The wind howled through the canyon, a low, mournful sound that had become almost comforting to the cowboy. He had grown used to the solitude, to the quiet of the open land, and to the endless horizon stretching out before him, a never-ending sea of grass and sagebrush that seemed to pull him forward, day after day. The cowboy was no stranger to hardship. It was a constant companion on the long, dusty trails of the West. He had been traveling for days, and the blistering sun beat down on him relentlessly. Every muscle in his body ached, and the dust clung to his skin like a second layer. His lips were cracked, and his throat dry from the lack of water. But the cowboy was used to it. He had been living in the wild for as long as he could remember, a drifter with no permanent home, no family to speak of. Just the open plains and the winding trails that seemed to lead him nowhere yet everywhere at once. His name was Jack Malone. But to most, he was just the cowboy. A lone figure whose name was whispered in the shadows of saloons and campfires. A man with a past he rarely spoke of. A man who had nothing to keep him tied to any place or person. As he rode Jack's mind wandered back to the years that had shaped him. He had once been part of a family, a proud ranching family in Texas. But the fire that had consumed his home years ago had taken everything from him. His parents, his siblings, his future. He had left Texas shortly after the fire, a restless soul with no place to belong, no reason to stay. The loss had carved a permanent hole in his heart, and over the years, he had filled it with the emptiness of the open road, the cold nights beneath the stars, and the companionship of his horse. He had seen the faces of many people, but none had ever been able to fill the void that the fire had left behind. The land around him was barren, a sea of brown and gold, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the earth like dark fingers reaching out, grasping for something they could never touch. Jack's gaze wandered over the rolling hills, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind and the rhythmic pounding of Thunder's hooves. It was then, in the stillness of the desert, that Jack noticed something unusual. A flicker of movement on the edge of the distant horizon caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a mirage, the heat playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew closer, he realized it was something more, a small figure waving in the distance. His heart skipped a beat, a sense of unease settling in his chest. The West was a harsh land, unforgiving to those who weren't prepared, and Jack had seen enough to know that any sign of human life out here could mean trouble. But something about the figure tugged at his instincts, a sense of urgency that made him push Thunder into a gallop. As the distance closed, Jack could make out the details of the scene. A woman, her clothing torn and stained with the dust of the desert, stood beside a broken-down wagon. The woman's face was gaunt, her skin pale from days without water, and her movements were slow, almost lifeless. Behind her, 5 children sat on the cracked earth, their faces etched with hunger and exhaustion. They were all dressed in rags, their small bodies sunken from dehydration. The children barely moved, their eyes vacant and distant, as though they had long since given up on the hope of survival. The sight struck Jack like a punch to the gut. Thunder slowed to a trot as Jack approached the group. The woman's eyes, dulled with despair, flicked up to meet his gaze. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of the desert pressing in around them. Jack dismounted and walked toward the woman, his boots kicking up more dust with each step. He could feel the heat radiating from the ground beneath him, but his focus remained on the family in front of him. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. It was as though she had forgotten how to speak, how to ask for help. Her throat was dry, her voice a hoarse whisper when she finally managed to croak, "Please, help us." Jack could feel his heart tighten. He had seen many desperate situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple case of bad luck or misfortune. These people were on the edge of death, abandoned in the desert with no hope of survival. The cowboy's instincts kicked in, overriding any hesitation. He knew what had to be done. Without another word, he turned to his horse, instructing the woman and children to climb onto the wagon. His mind raced with plans, but all he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave them here to die. Not on his watch. With urgency in his every movement, Jack helped them into the wagon, checking to make sure the children were settled and comfortable. He could see the relief in their eyes, but it was fleeting. They knew they were still in danger, still far from safety. Jack didn't waste any time. He climbed back onto Thunder, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no time to waste. He had to get them out of here. As the cowboy guided the wagon toward the distant hills, the desert seemed to close in around them. The wind picked up, and the sun seemed even harsher now, as if it were punishing them for daring to survive. But Jack's determination never wavered. He would not let these people die. Not today. Not while he still had breath in his body. The air around the cowboy and the family was thick with tension, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. The woman, Sarah, was frail and weary, the harshness of the land etched into every line of her face. Her once bright and hopeful eyes were now dimmed with exhaustion and a painful acceptance of her situation. Her clothes, which had once been practical and sturdy, were now torn and ragged, the fabric faded from the relentless exposure to the sun. There was a faint scent of sweat and dirt in the air, mingling with the sharp, dry smell of the desert. She had been strong once, a woman with the fire of life burning in her heart, full of dreams and aspirations for herself and her children. But that fire had been dimmed by the unrelenting hardship she had faced in the past months. She had grown up in a small town in Colorado, where her family had a farm that had provided them with a comfortable life. She had married young to a man named Thomas, a hard-working rancher who had promised her a future of stability and love. But the promise of that life was now nothing but a distant memory, a dream that had been shattered beyond recognition. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man of ambition, always dreaming of striking it rich in the gold mines. It was a dream that had cost them dearly. Sarah had warned him time and again that the desert was unforgiving, that the land could be as cruel as it was beautiful, but Thomas had been determined. The gamble he had taken in the mining venture ended in disaster. The mine collapsed, and with it, Thomas's life. Sarah was left to pick up the pieces, to care for 5 children and keep them alive in a world that seemed to have turned its back on them. Her heart ached as she looked down at her children, who had become the true source of her strength. They were her everything. Her heart, once heavy with grief, now beat only for them. Each of their faces told a story of struggle, of the toll the journey had taken on them. The oldest, Emma, was just 15, but she had the wisdom of someone much older. Her eyes, though tired, still held a flicker of hope, and her determination to protect her younger siblings was evident in every step she took. She had already taken on the role of second mother to the others, trying to keep them calm and reassure them in the face of their mounting fear. Next was Samuel, a quiet boy of 10, whose big brown eyes seemed to absorb everything around him. He had always been a gentle soul, preferring to spend his time with the animals, but the cruelty of the desert had hardened him. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he clutched a small, worn-out toy horse that had once been his father's. The toy, though broken and battered, had somehow survived the journey, a small piece of the life they had lost. Then there was young Lily, who was only 8 years old, but already showed signs of the quiet strength that her mother had passed on to her. Lily's wide blue eyes were filled with both fear and curiosity, a child's innate desire to understand the world around her despite the hardships. She had been silent for most of the journey, her small hands tightly gripping the edge of the wagon as though it were her only lifeline. At the back of the wagon sat the 2 youngest Charlie and Clara twins, just 5 years old. Their tiny bodies were curled into each other, seeking comfort in the shared warmth. Clara clung to her brother, her small face pressed into his shoulder, as though the world around her had become too much to bear. Charlie, always the more adventurous of the 2, had somehow managed to smile through the tears, his face streaked with dirt but his eyes still shining with a flicker of innocence. The journey had taken its toll on the children. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies frail from days. Without adequate food or water, they had all lost weight, the skin on their arms and faces hanging loose, and their once lively laughter had been replaced by quiet, empty stares. Sarah knew they were on the brink, just one more day of this unrelenting heat and thirst away from collapsing. Sarah tried to recall the last time they had eaten. It had been 2 days ago. A handful of dried fruit they had rationed, and before that, a few crusts of bread that had long since lost their flavor. The water they had been carrying had run out by noon, leaving them to suffer under the unyielding sun without relief. She had tried to make the children believe they would make it, that they would survive, but in her heart she had known the truth. They were running out of time. She had heard rumors of a town to the north, a place where there might be help, where people could take them in. But the rumors were vague, and every direction they had tried had only led them deeper into the wilderness. Their wagon had broken down weeks ago, and there was no way to fix it. The wheels had cracked, the axles had snapped, and the few remaining supplies they had carried on the wagon were now nothing more than empty sacks and cans, relics of a journey that had gone terribly wrong. It was at this moment that Sarah's strength, worn thin by grief and desperation, nearly gave out. She had walked for miles, trying to keep the children moving, to keep them alive long enough to reach help. But now, with no more water, no food, and no hope left, she had reached her breaking point. It was as if the desert had slowly drained her of everything she had left. And when she saw the cowboy approach, his silhouette growing larger against the blazing sun, she knew it was not just a man, not just a stranger. He was a lifeline, an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared speak aloud. As Jack Malone approached them, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. She was too exhausted to feel much of anything, but deep inside, something stirred. Hope. That old, familiar feeling she hadn't dared to embrace in so long. She had seen so many people pass by in her life. Some had offered kind words. Some had ignored her plight altogether. But this cowboy, there was something different about him. It wasn't just his weathered face or the hard set of his jaw that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. No, it was his eyes calm, knowing, and filled with an understanding that went beyond words. In his gaze, she saw that he had lived through loss, through hardship, and that perhaps, just perhaps, he could help them. Sarah's voice broke the silence when she managed to speak, her words weak and cracked from days of dehydration. Please, help us. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a mother's desperation. A plea from a soul who had nothing left to give but hope. It was in that moment, as she looked up at Jack, that she realized she wasn't just asking for help. She was asking for a chance to survive. Jack Malone's eyes scanned the desolate landscape, his gaze flicking between the broken wagon, the haggard woman, and the children whose faint, weary eyes watched him with a mixture of hope and fear. He had faced many difficult decisions in his life, but this was different. There was no hesitation in his heart, no second-guessing the instincts that had led him to this moment. The cowboy was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. For as long as he could remember, survival had been his only constant, and that same survival instinct now took over, pushing him to act decisively. Jack had never considered himself a hero. Heroes were the ones who wore capes, who had families to return to, who made speeches about doing good in the world. He was just a man adrifter, a cowboy with no ties, no roots, no place to call home. His life had been shaped by hardship, and he had learned to depend on no one but himself. But something about this family, something about Sarah's tired, pleading eyes and the sight of those young children struck a chord deep inside him, one he hadn't expected to resonate. They weren't just a family stranded in the desert. They were a reminder of everything he had once lost. They were a reflection of the very life he had turned his back on years ago when he had walked away from everything he knew, escaping the pain of losing his own family in that tragic fire. As he surveyed the scene, Jack's instincts told him they didn't have much time. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the barren plains. There was a chill in the air now, but it wouldn't last. The desert was cruel in its unpredictability, and the night would bring a biting cold that could be fatal for those already weakened by the heat of the day. The wind, which had been a faint whisper earlier, was beginning to pick up, stirring the dry earth into a swirling cloud of dust. Jack knew they needed to leave immediately. Without saying a word, he quickly assessed the situation. Thunder, his horse, was still strong, but the journey ahead would be long and arduous. He glanced at the broken wagon, which was beyond repair. The only option was to move them on horseback, but even that presented challenges. Sarah was too weak to ride on her own, and the children were in no condition to walk any further. Jack had always been a man of action. His thoughts didn't linger for long, but now his mind worked quickly, calculating the best course of action for the survival of the family. He approached Sarah first, his movements steady and sure. She looked up at him, her expression one of disbelief, as if she couldn't quite grasp what was happening. She had been trapped in this nightmare for so long that the idea of salvation seemed almost too good to be true. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had no strength left to speak, and her body seemed to shrink under the weight of the despair that had clouded her heart for days. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jack said quietly, his voice low but steady. There was no need for more words. The promise was in the way he held her gaze, the way he moved to gather the children and lead them to safety. There was no room for fear or hesitation now. He helped Sarah onto Thunder, guiding her gently onto the saddle. Her body was frail and unsteady, but she clung to him for support as she mounted the horse. The weight of the woman on his horse was a reminder of the fragile balance between life and death in this unforgiving desert. With a firm grip, Jack adjusted the reins and turned Thunder around. He looked back at the children, who were still sitting in a daze on the ground, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. "Come on, now," Jack said, his voice more forceful this time, though still kind. "Get up here. We're getting out of here." The older children, Emma and Samuel, slowly stood up, their legs shaky beneath them. Jack motioned for Emma to climb up behind Sarah, and Samuel followed shortly after. The other children, Charlie and Clara, were too small and weak to walk far, so Jack gently lifted them one by one, cradling them in his arms like fragile dolls. He placed Clara in front of Sarah, her small body trembling, and Charlie behind Emma. With the family now gathered on Thunder, Jack quickly mounted his horse and turned them toward the horizon. The path ahead was not easy. There were miles of desolate land to cross before they could find shelter. But Jack's mind was clear, focused, entirely on getting them to safety. The weight of responsibility settled upon him, but it was a burden he welcomed. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back the family he had lost, but he could make sure this one had a chance. The journey was slow at first, as Thunder carried them across the harsh, unforgiving landscape. The sun had begun to sink beneath the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers of darkness across the earth. The desert was beautiful in its own way, but it was a beauty that came at a high cost. The stillness of the land felt oppressive, as if the very air itself were conspiring to keep them from moving forward. Sarah sat slumped against Jack's back, her exhaustion evident in the way she clung to him for support. She was silent, her head resting against his shoulder, but Jack could feel the weight of her gratitude in the way she gripped the reins. Her children were quiet too, their once lively voices reduced to soft whispers and occasional coughs. Jack's thoughts were consumed with one thing: survival. The land was indifferent to them, as indifferent as the hardships they had faced. But Jack had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. Hours passed, and the desert, with all its vast emptiness, seemed to swallow them whole. Jack's mind raced, but his body remained steady, guiding them through the night. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let them die out here. It was in the midst of that long, silent journey that Jack finally allowed himself to think about the family's future, about what might come after they found safety. He wasn't sure what he would do with them once they made it out of the desert, but that wasn't important now. What mattered was that he had found them, that he had made the decision to help, and that he was going to see it through, one step at a time. As the days passed, the desert began to reveal its merciless beauty. But for Sarah and her children, there was something more to it now. The vast emptiness, which had once felt like a graveyard for their hopes, began to feel like a land of possibility. It was strange, almost surreal, how one man's intervention could so completely alter the course of their lives. Jack Malone had not just saved them from death. He had given them something far more valuable, the chance to rebuild. The first night they spent away from the desert was quiet. The sounds of the wind in the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the desert. They had reached a small ranch just as the last light of the setting sun had vanished behind the mountains. The ranch was modest but sturdy, with a stone house and a barn that looked like it had been standing for decades. Jack had known the ranch owner, a man named Henry, who had welcomed them with open arms despite his own meager means. There was something about the place, something grounded and simple that felt right. It wasn't a palace, but it offered the safety and warmth they so desperately needed. Henry was a man of few words, but his kindness was apparent in every action. He led them to the small guest room at the back of the house, where a fire was, already crackling in the hearth, its warmth a balm to their cold, tired bodies. As Sarah sat by the fire, finally able to rest without the constant worry of survival hanging over her, she let out a long, slow breath, as if the weight of months of struggle was finally starting to lift. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this kind of peace. Her children, though still weak, were beginning to show signs of life again. They laughed quietly in the corner, their faces flushed with warmth from the fire, their eyes bright with the relief of knowing they were no longer alone in the world. In the days that followed, Sarah worked to get her bearings. She helped Henry with small chores around the ranch, learning the rhythms of farm life in the way she had once learned to run her own home. The hard, physical labor was exhausting, but it was a good kind of tired. It reminded her of a time when her life had been full of purpose, when she had worked alongside Thomas to care for the land and provide for her children. Every task she took on, whether it was gathering firewood, feeding the chickens, or learning how to mend fences, filled her with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The ranch may not have been her dream, but it was a refuge, a place where she could begin to heal. For Jack, the journey was far from over. He had promised Sarah that he would see them through, and he wasn't about to back down now. He spent his days working alongside Henry, fixing fences and tending to the livestock, his steady presence becoming a constant in their lives. There was something about the ranch that seemed to ground him, something that made him feel more connected to the world than he had in years. The wide, open sky, the hum of the wind, the workette, all felt like a way to atone for the things he had done in his past, to prove to himself that he could still do something good. Sarah watched Jack as he worked, her gratitude for him growing. Each day, she had seen the way he moved, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done without ever being asked. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. It was clear that he had seen his share of suffering, that he understood what it meant to fight against the odds, and that he would not leave them until they were truly safe. She felt a sense of security in his presence, a security she hadn't felt since the day she had lost everything. As the days stretched into weeks, the children grew stronger. Emma, once so full of worry, began to take on more responsibilities. Around the ranch, helping her mother with the chores and learning how to care for the animals. Samuel, too, found purpose in the work, tending to the horses and helping Jack in the fields. The twins, Charlie and Clara, who had been so quiet and fearful, began to play again, their laughter echoing through the fields as they explored the ranch together. Lily, though still the youngest, had found a new sense of wonder, and her eyes were wide with curiosity as she followed her older siblings, asking questions about the animals and the land. But it wasn't just the children who were healing. Sarah's heart, which had been broken by the loss of Thomas and the struggles of their journey, began to mend in small ways. Every day, she grew a little stronger, a little more confident, and a little more determined to rebuild her life. She no longer saw the world as a place of endless pain and loss. She had Jack to thank for that. Without his intervention, without his determination to help, she knew they would have been lost. She would have been lost. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields, Jack and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the children run and play in the distance. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken bond that neither of them had expected. Sarah had never believed in fate, but there was something about this moment that made her wonder. How could one man's decision to stop and help change everything? "I never thought I'd be here," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She had been thinking about the long, hard road they had traveled and how far they had come. "I never thought I'd see my children smile again." "You saved us, Jack." Jack didn't respond immediately. He just looked out at the land, the wind, tugging at his hat, his face a mask of stoic calm. Finally, he turned to her, his blue eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that made her heart ache. "You saved them too," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're stronger than you know. All of you are." Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude, and she found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't just Jack who had changed their lives. There was the strength they had found in themselves, the resilience that had carried them through the hardest times. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Sarah and her children began to carve out a new life for themselves. The ranch, though modest, became their sanctuary, a place where they could heal, rebuild, and thrive. Jack's presence in their lives became a steady source of strength, and over time, they all learned the true meaning of survival, not just surviving in the face of hardship, but living, truly living, and finding purpose even in the most difficult circumstances. And so, what began as a desperate plea for help on the unforgiving desert plains became the foundation of a new life, one that would carry them through the storms to come, strengthened by the kindness of a stranger who had chosen, without question, to make their struggle his own.